I'm going to be talking today, as Matthew mentioned earlier, about our development of the world's first wash for sanitation development impact bond. I will start by giving a quick overview of IDE. I'm going to talk a little bit about our Sanitation Marketing Scale-Up Program, or the SMSU program in Cambodia, just to give you some context for and history for where we're working. I'm going to play the journalist and do the why, what, who, and when of the Cambodia Rural Sanitation DIB. I'm going to try to give just a fairly quick overview of each of those things, and then talk about some lessons learned. So, quick introduction to IDE. I have two folks from my comms team sitting right in the front row here, and I'm probably going to get a talking to afterwards about all the text on this slide. But I think it's probably better just to look over here. These are sort of four of our brand pillars that we think about. So starting with people, in everything that we do, we work both in WASH and agriculture and nutrition. We start with people, so we take a human-centered design approach to understanding what are the problems, barriers, issues that people and businesses are facing in the community, and design our solutions around that. We then design to context, so obviously related to the human-centered design component, making sure that what we're doing in Bangladesh probably doesn't look exactly like what we're doing in Cambodia. No news to folks who do work across the world. I think really the core component of what we do and what IDE stands for is the belief that business delivers. So in everything that we do, we think about how do we leverage local businesses, local entrepreneurs, and how do we build local market systems to deliver solutions to the people who need them, typically thinking about the rural poor as our target customer. And then lastly, results rule. So we've had presentations at this conference in the past about our management information systems. We have worked over the past 10 years or so to build a Salesforce-based MIS, management information system, that really gives us real-time data and the ability to understand over time what's happening in the markets where we're working. I'll talk a little bit about that today and how it informed the work of the DIB. So the Sanitation Marketing Scale-Up Program, or the SMSU program, this is a program that's been running for the past 10 years, since 2009 in Cambodia. We've sold and delivered over, that's actually an outdated number, it's over 335,000 toilets in 6 Cambodian provinces where we're working. If you look at the SMSU program, it's really a good manifestation of the IDE philosophy. So we started by looking at back in 2009, what do people want in a toilet? Where can people buy toilets? And what we found was that people wanted a toilet that they could be proud of, that gave their family safety and security, and that obviously they could afford. What we found was that even if you wanted to buy a toilet like that in Cambodia 10 years ago, it was really hard to do so. You typically have to go to 3 to 5 different suppliers to buy the materials, get an installer, etc. And so we designed the Easy Latrine toilet, which has become the core product in our product portfolio. We've expanded a bit beyond that since then. But overall, sold about 335,000 Easy Latrines. In the 6 provinces where we're working, we've contributed to a pretty significant boost in sanitation coverage. You can see that from about 30% back in 2009 to 67%. It's actually a bit higher these days. And we've always looked at this as an integrated program. So we've had a lot of really great funding partners. You can see them listed up there. The really key ones for our purposes here, and the funders that I'll talk about today, are USAID and the Stone Family Foundation. So those are the two partners within the Development Impact Bond. And then we're also funded by DFAT, the Australian government. They're not involved in the DIB, but they're involved in the integrated SMSU program. So it's a history of SMSU. This is just a pictorial representation of that. So a couple of different lines here. You can see the blue shaded area is just the cumulative sales that SMSU has facilitated through our local business partners in Cambodia. And the green line, so you can see we kind of start through 2013 in our early piloting and implementation, and it really ramps up from 2013 onwards. And then this is a cost effectiveness curve. So this is just looking at what does it cost us as a program to deliver each toilet, and it's just a 6-month running average. So what you can see, our thesis has always been that using a markets approach means that you have a lot of upfront investment as you're building local market infrastructure, as you're training the local businesses that are building and installing these latrines, as you're training the sales agents that are selling these latrines to households and to villages, as you're putting in place the systems and the personnel, et cetera, to get the program running. But that over time, as that market infrastructure is in place, as those entrepreneurs are in place, your cost effectiveness should improve over time because you've made those upfront investments. We see that story play itself out over the past 10 years. You can see this was sort of our piloting. This was when we started our second phase of the program, and you can see the costs were driven down pretty significantly. And starting in 2017, they started to go up. And that feeds into the story of where we were in 2017 as we started thinking about the DIB. We were pushing into higher and higher coverage rates. The people who didn't have toilets were sometimes poor, harder to reach, and there were just less households that needed toilets. So making each sale was more and more difficult. So as we got into 2017, this slide says the future of SMSU, but this is actually going back to the future. So this is thinking back to about 2017 when we were wrapping up our second phase of the program, SMSU 2. This was where we were getting up into the high 60s in terms of coverage rates. A couple of things were in place. So we had this, what we felt like was a really good proven model. We'd sold upwards of 200,000 latrines at that point. So we had a good track record of performance. We knew that over the next several years, our aim was going to be in those 6 provinces and communities where we were working was to get the job done, to push towards open defecation-free status, both as an organizational goal, but also contributing to the Cambodia national government's goal of getting to 100% ODF by 2025. At the same time, so we knew we had this model in place. We knew that as the market again got more difficult, as we got further and further into market saturation, we were going to have to iterate and adapt. So this core sanitation marketing model was going to have to change in some pretty fundamental ways, some of which we really couldn't predict back then. So that was where we were with the SMSU program in 2017, and thinking about how are we going to fund this third phase of the program? What kind of funders are we going to need to have in place to give us that flexibility, but also obviously the amount of funding that goes into funding a program at scale. So in 2017 at the UNC Water and Health Conference, we were sitting in a room with Stone Family Foundation, who again was one of our longtime funders, and I believe it was Social Finance, if you've heard of Social Finance, gave a presentation on what development impact bonds were. And a light bulb went off, I think, simultaneously in our heads and also in Stone Family Foundation as potentially meeting a lot of the criteria that we needed to fund SMSU 3. Quickly, for those who aren't familiar with development impact bonds, I'll get into what the mechanics of it look like in our case specifically. But the things that you really need to know are it's a results-based mechanism, so you're paid on outcomes. And there are 3 primary actors here. So there's the implementer. This is the organization that's doing the work on the ground. There's the investor. So the investor could be an institutional investor, an individual. It could be a foundation. They're providing the upfront risk capital to fund the program in the early days of implementation. And then there's the outcomes buyer, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's a buyer, or it's often a government entity, but can be any party that's paying based on outcomes. And I'll get into what the outcomes look like in the case of the DIB. The key conditions, as we listened to social finance, as we did research on development impact bonds in the sector, or globally, there were no WASH development impact bonds at that time. The key conditions were, first of all, this is probably obvious, but you should have measurable and attributable outcomes. And the second part of that is having reliable data. And this is where those management information systems that we've invested in over the years came in. And the second is, and I've already spoken to this, but you need to have a proven model in place, right? So you want to be able to say to both the investor who's putting the capital up front and also the outcomes buyer who has an interest in achieving those outcomes, you want to be able to say, yeah, we think that we can achieve these outcomes based on what we've done in the past. But it also makes sense to have, if you think that you just got a model, you can just keep moving forward with it, you don't really have to make many changes. Development impact bond doesn't necessarily make sense because really what you're buying with an outcomes-based mechanism like this is flexibility and adaptability. So having the need for that iteration is a really key component of putting together a DIP. So the key DIB partners, we got the idea that we think a development impact bond is the right way to go. We had this longtime partner in the Stone Family Foundation who thought that might be a good idea too. As luck would have it, they were looking to get into innovative financing. So they'd always been a grant-making organization, and they were really looking into figuring out how do we serve as an example for the sector on how we can inject new funding into the system, funding that wouldn't be there otherwise. And how do we kind of be the risky first actor in that space? So we kind of got together as a team, and I think the third actor here is the outcomes buyer, which is USAID, and I'll get to them in a second here. So as I mentioned, we started the conversations back in 2017. Came to really early consensus with Stone that we thought a DIB could be a workable mechanism. And we thought, great, we'll go find an outcomes buyer. Shouldn't be too hard. Turned out that was the really hard part, actually. What we'd heard from others that had done DIBs before was that actually oftentimes it's the outcomes buyer that's really easy to find. And you can see why that would be, because for the outcomes buyer, it's a great deal, right? You're completely shifting the risk from a USAID who's typically paying upfront and may or may not get the results that they're looking for. You're shifting that risk over to a third party, to the investor. So you can see how outcomes buyer would just be banging down the door. $10 million, we'll give it to you, but only if you get the work done. But for whatever reason, it turned out to be tough. I think largely because, especially in the wash space, again, it's cool to be the first mover, but it's also risky, right? Who knows if it's going to work? So we got into conversations with a number of potential outcomes buyers, and ultimately were able to come to an agreement with USAID, and USAID specifically in Cambodia. So the agreement is actually with the mission as opposed to USAID globally. Got all those partners in place. Finalizing the deal took 9 months, which I don't know if that sounds like a long time to anybody. It felt like a long time, but actually, according to Social Finance, who again works a lot of these deals, that was actually the fastest DIB ever to go through their system. And I think I'll talk about this a little bit in the lessons learned, but I think that was largely because we had two parties coming to the table, Stone and IDE, who were used to working with each other. We trusted each other. We had a really good relationship, and that was able to kind of carry over into our negotiations with USAID. And just really important, I've pointed out a couple of times or mentioned that, but Social Finance was, I call them the broker. They were really the ones who brought all these parties to the table, introduced us to the concept of the DIB, really understood what they were doing, because all three of the parties coming to the table had never done anything like this. Again, three parties, Stone, IDE, USAID. Stone has invested roughly about $3.5 million up front to fund the work that SMSU is doing. We're doing the work on the ground. I won't get too much into the technical details of the work that we're doing in the program and how it's shifted over time, but I'm happy to answer those questions here or if you want to chat afterwards. We ended up settling this. I think this is the key point. We ended up settling on one outcome, and that was 1,600 villages submitting ODF claims. This was, of the 9 months, this was like a pretty decent part of that 9 months, figuring out what is the outcome that we're going to measure on. What is the right part of the outcomes chain to think about? Is it trying to go all the way to health outcomes? The answer to us was no. It's hard to attribute, it's hard to measure, it takes time, etc. Was it toilets sold? No, because that's not really, in a lot of people's minds, it's not an outcome. And really, what we're trying to push towards is helping the Cambodian government, or allowing the Cambodian government to achieve that goal of ODF status by 2025. So outcomes, the 1,600 villages with ODF claims ended up kind of being the sweet spot for us. So what happens mechanically is we work, we get villages to ODF status, we submit a milestone report to USAID, and ultimately they're feeding funds back into Stone Family Foundation. So that money is coming into Stone, and they're recycling that outcomes funding to us to fund the continuation of the program over the next 4 years. It doesn't state it on here, but the really, I think, innovative part of a development impact bond is that Stone Family Foundation, if everything goes well, stands to make a return on their investment. And actually, I don't know if this is totally unique, but I think it's rare. There's actually an opportunity for IDE to earn a return, quote unquote, on the work that we're doing. Assuming that we get to those 1,600 villages. So, just some quick lessons learned here. I've already touched on most of these. Bringing the right partners to the table. So figuring out what are the incentives of the various partners that you want to be working with. IDE wants to keep doing the work that we're doing, but we know we're going to need to change. Stone Family Foundation wants to be a thought leader in the innovative financing space and has the risk profile that they need to do that. And then USAID, I didn't really mention this, I guess, but USAID also in Cambodia specifically was really interested in being on the forefront of the innovative financing conversation too. And so that was ultimately kind of the hook that brought them into this conversation. The importance of having those relationships in place beforehand, I'll say pretty categorically, I'm not sure if we would have made it through the negotiations process if we didn't have that really strong, trustful relationship with Stone Family Foundation, which we built over 4 or 5 years. The DIB, it's really complicated, and especially if you're 3 organizations coming to the table, never having done this before, trying to keep things as simple as possible, ultimately settling on one outcome for measurement, I think really behooved us or benefited us, and keeping the structure relatively simple. I mean, it looks very simple on that graphic that I showed, and ultimately it is. There's a lot of contractual language that goes behind it, but. Having the right data from the beginning, this again is where our really strong MIS came into play. So we were able to say, over those 10 years, what did our operations look like? What did our performance look like? And also, what did it cost us to do that? So we were able to cost out, hopefully pretty accurately what we thought it might cost us to get to each ODF village, and to project that out so that we could say with $9.99 million, this is what we think we can achieve. And then this is sort of just a broader point, but again, just aligning the incentives across all partners. So with Stone really wanting to be a thought leader and wanting to demonstrate to not just other kind of small to medium-sized family foundations, but also to real, institutional and individual investors that investing in WASH can be an attractive investment. I think without that desire on Stone Family Foundation's part, I'm not sure we would have been at the table to begin with.